Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the second of two lecture pods for week 6 of Australian politics in spring 2020. First pod, as hopefully you're already aware, was about the question of trust and whether or not there is a crisis in trust in Australian public life and amongst Australians more broadly. The second follow-up pod, and sorry for the late arrival of this, is about populism and its relationship to trust. And on the right hand side of the screen there you can of course see top right hand corner a familiar American political figure, and bottom right hand corner, as I discussed in the first pod, the two individuals whose conflict together seems to have precipitated a crisis of trust in Australian politics in recent years. The word populism is out there in the world, particularly since 2016 and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. There has been quite visibly a rise across the globe in governments and parties and movements and individual leaders who are being described, sometimes describing themselves actually, as populist, or have ridden waves of, pardon for the typo there, popular discontent with the political establishment that seem to identify them as populist. And I put the word establishment in inverted commas there because, of course, it's meant as a pejorative term or a boo term. The suggestion is that the mainstream political parties or movements or leaders are part of an insiders club, and that groups and individuals and parties corresponding to the description populist are outsiders, insurgents, breaking into politics from the outside. Whether or not that's actually true is another question, but that's the way these folks depict themselves. The most spectacular example, of course, in recent years, lovingly documented in the media, has been the United States as Donald Trump, who emerged quite unexpectedly to most people, not perhaps to the pollsters, as the Republican Party's candidate for the presidency in 2016, and went on to win a somewhat controversial election. We failed to win a majority of the popular vote, but won a majority of the vote in the Electoral College. Clearly, this is not the space to go into Donald Trump in detail, and it would take too long, and we'd need a whole topic which is not Australian politics. But clearly Donald Trump was drawing upon some specifically American concerns, but also upon things that are common to popular discontent in a range of other countries around the world, especially the Western world. He was clearly riffing off the dramatic decline of American manufacturing industry over the last 10 to 20 years, which he's depicted as being at the expense of the rise of China. And he was also clearly responding to the enduring economic and social traumas that the washover from the global financial crisis of 2008 and afterwards have had in American life. America, of course, tried to hold its currency and its economy in line throughout the GFC to try and keep the global financial system in order, and partly as a result of that suffered quite devastating economic and financial losses, which are still reverberating, and clearly which Donald Trump has used to underpin his populist message that he's done, well, he did effectively for at least 3 of the last 4 years. And in the process, Trump, of course, has taken the longest established, most venerated American political institution, actually, the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, and succeeded in turning it effectively into his own personal vehicle. As I speak, the Republican Party in the United States has announced the speakers at its national convention, half of whom will be members of the Trump family. And the speakers at the Republican National Convention don't include a single former senior Republican figure of any kind from the last several decades. It has become the party of Trump. In the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson's government there is another famous and prominent example of Western populism right now. Though certainly not the only government in Europe. Johnson rode the Brexit wave into power. A tide of disaffection was what was seen as elite positions in relation to Britain's place in Europe. Again, Britain being depicted by Johnson as a loser out of its alliance with Europe through the European Union, just as Trump presented America as the loser of them in almost every economic alliance it had with any country in the world. In the developing world, there have been other famous examples such as Bolsonaro in Brazil and Duterte in the Philippines. But that's perhaps not so surprising to political observers, since populism has a long history in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and other parts of the developing world. The resurgence of populism in the developed, so-called developed world, maybe undeveloping world, is a more surprising development and appears to kick against most of the major currents of Western politics since the Second World War. What is populism? The question of the moment. Most Western political parties, at least the major parties since the Second World War, have fitted themselves or been described by observers in terms of the political spectrum that we spoke about last week. Commonly they describe themselves as, or are described as, conservative or liberal or social democrat or socialist. Environmental parties are a little bit different, but they still get placed on the spectrum, nearly always on the left. Populist parties, or parties described in this way, parties, movements, candidates, leadership figures, tend not to fit easily into these descriptors. In the United States, Donald Trump is the effective leader of the Republican Party, traditionally a conservative party, but his policies and his rhetoric do not fit traditional conservatism very neatly. They appear to borrow from everywhere on the spectrum, actually, and that's a characteristic of populism, to be borrowing ideas, slogans, ideals from right and left simultaneously, even though most commonly populist parties appear on the right. Certainly not always. In Britain, at the same time that Boris Johnson was turning the Conservative Party populist, Jeremy Corbyn was taking Labour in a more populist direction as well. And in the United States, Bernie Sanders has twice got reasonably close to taking the Democratic Party into a populist direction too, from the left. Populist parties and movements, third dot point here, particularly those of a right-wing disposition, tend to be aggressively nationalist. The world has cheated or mistreated their own country. Donald Trump's central slogan, of course, is America First. Almost every trade deal the United States has signed with another country or group of countries since World War II has been to the detriment of the United States, he insists, and he is the first president, in fact, ever in American history to remedy this. Other countries are most commonly seen as foes, rivals, enemies, undermining, cheating, two-timing, stealing. Except for those countries that share, whose governments or leaders share a similar populist spirit. It's notorious, of course, that Donald Trump has a strange affection for Vladimir Putin. Populism, I said already, is not new. In many respects, it's been the norm in large parts of Latin America since at least it was in the second half of the 20th century, less so since the turn of the century. And been an important player in many parts of the developing world where party systems have often not been so left-right focused as they have been in Western countries. But the eruption of populism into Western politics since 2008, and more recently, of course, since 2016, has surprised commentators and thrown political commentary into a degree of confusion. Lastly, Australia has not seen, at least so far, an explosion of populism on the same scale as Europe or the United States. And by the way, I've mentioned United Kingdom or Great Britain before, but populist movements have been dramatically successful in Central and Eastern Europe as well, and also countries like Italy and Spain. So large parts of Europe have become colonised by populism. Even France has had a quite different kind of populism from the centre, strangely. Clive Palmer clearly was attempting for a while there to be a kind of Australian Donald Trump, but not doing a very good job of it. And after what appeared to be a certain kind of flirtation with populism, Scott Morrison, I think it's fair to say, has not been a populist Prime Minister. In fact, his response to the pandemic crisis this year has been a mainstream establishment kind of political response. It's been bureaucratic, it's been focused on science. He hasn't attacked the scientists, he hasn't attempted to downplay the pandemic in the way that populists elsewhere in the world, such as Trump or Bolsonaro, have. Also, it's worth remembering that Australia has been less traumatised by some of the dramatic global economic tides of the last 10 to 20 years. We got our economic restructuring over and done with in the 1980s and 1990s, and have had a relatively gentle passage into industrial decline since that time, entirely unlike the United States, which has been traumatised by its deindustrialisation. And we have not, on the whole, been afflicted by deeply divisive debates such as the Brexit debate was in the United Kingdom, where it dominated politics for several years. It still does to some extent. However, observers have noticed the close correspondence between populism and political mistrust, that when voters' mistrust of parties and institutions, political and other, rise, so populism becomes more politically attractive, not least, I think, because populism encourages a mistrust of the establishment or the mainstream, and tends to encourage a mistrust with regular political activity, and instead to present populist politics as a genuine response to popular discontent with politics. However, because mistrust in politics and institutions has been growing in Australia in recent years, and I talked about that in the first pod, commentators, I think, are broadly agreed that a populist current in Australian politics may well grow over the next few years.